Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Martha Minow, and as Dean of the Law School, I couldn't be more delighted to welcome you to this very unusual event. And I'm going to begin by quoting each of our speakers. Leon Wieseltier said, "The task is not to intellectualize humanity, it is to humanize intellectuality." He also said, "An open mind is not an empty mind." And he said, "There are times when the power of language is not the power that is needed." And just one more, he said, reviewing someone's book, "Her book about the money in sex gives you the feeling of the sex in money." Faust has said, "I lived in a world where social arrangements were taken for granted and assumed to be timeless. A child's obligation was to learn these usages, not to question them. The complexities of racial deportment were of a piece with learning manners and etiquette more generally." And she said, "As a kid, I was growing up in an era of celebration of the Civil War centennial with a lot of lost cause emphasis on the Confederacy. I used to play Civil War soldiers with my brothers as a child, and my older brother always insisted that he got to be Lee and I got to be Grant. I never knew that Grant won until quite some time had passed." And she also said recently, "Justice is not born only of hope. Justice makes demands beyond the patience and passivity." She was referring to Seamus Heaney, the poet, that he portrays in his moving lines. I think, given these just samples, you'll see why this will be a very interesting conversation. So just a word about each of our participants here. Leon Wieseltier is here, we are so thrilled, as the Gruss Professor of Talmudic Law. And I heard recently someone say, there's no better way to learn Talmud or what it's about than to either read Talmud or read Leon Wieseltier's book, Kaddish. And I think that's a very powerful statement because it's not about the answers, it's about the journey, it's about the inquiry. Currently at the Brookings Institute, the think tank, he is the Isaiah Berlin Senior Fellow in Culture and Policy, where he focuses on, and I quote him, "the influence of culture and the humanities on various realms of American life, society, and international affairs." And he previously was literary editor of The New Republic, and he currently also writes for The Atlantic. I could talk a lot about all the things that he has written, but then I would be taking time from him, so I won't. But I do think it's noteworthy that he recently won the Dan David Prize for being a foremost writer and thinker who confronts and engages with the central issues of our times, setting the standard for serious cultural discussion in the United States. A child of Holocaust survivors, he was born in Brooklyn, New York. He attended Yeshiva of Flatbush, Columbia University, Oxford University, and Harvard University, where he was also a member of the Harvard Society of Fellows. Faust, I think, is known to everybody here, but as the president of Harvard University, she has underscored the significance of higher education and the humanities, and she has also somehow, I don't know how, maintained her work and her life as a scholar, particularly of the Civil War. And one thing that joins you two is an interest in death. And I leave that to you to sort out. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Martha. So I get to pretend I'm Charlie Rose with Leon. He just did Charlie Rose a couple of weeks ago, actually, so I have a very high bar.
I get to pretend I'm Daniel Day-Lewis.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a good beginning. I thought it might be interesting if we started by talking about your journey and the two stops, I think just two along the way, that were Harvard, and what brought you to the place that you are today. How did it all begin, and what were the Harvard places? What role did Harvard play within
Well,
that?
it's funny you should say, I first came to Harvard in the summer of 1973. I was 21 years old, and I wanted to study Maimonides and Aquinas. I came for the summer. And I lived in the maid's room in a white wooden house on Hawthorne Street, which I passed for the first time in 500 years the other day. And since this is being recorded, so it's between us and the internet, that summer my parents refused to pay for tuition, so I had to write a pornographic novel to subsidize my studies in medieval religious philosophy, which is how I began my career at Harvard. It was the first book I ever published.
Did you use your
I
own
didn't,
name?
no, and I'm not going to tell you its title either. No. And then I came for graduate school. I was at Oxford studying philosophy in the mid-'70s, quite unhappily, in the sense that I had the misfortune of getting to Oxford the September after Quine, Kripke, and Davidson had all been there together for a year. So when I came to Oxford philosophy, if you wrote English and not mathematical notation, you were not a serious philosopher. You were a belletrist. And since I have no aptitude whatsoever for logic, that was not going to work. I was given sanctuary by Isaiah Berlin, then, which is to say, I was given an education by him. And after that, I decided I wanted to come and study Jewish history here at Harvard, because there were two scholars here named Tversky and Yerushalmi who were absolutely state of the art. And it wasn't clear to me that I ever wanted an academic career. What I wanted was to have enough authority in a field or about a subject that I truly loved. It was really about matriculating intellectually, not professionally, which came as a bit of a shock to one of my teachers, who assumed that I was just on the track, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was broke in graduate school in England, and so I began to write for the New York Review and the New Republic and all that, and I started doing that. So I had these, and then I had the great good fortune of being elected to the Society of Fellows. In the old days, when everybody stayed for 3 years, even if the job market was bad. When I left the society, one of the senior fellows there said something very touching to me. He said he wanted me to know that when they picked me, they had a debate. Some because they said that the problem was that I had 1 foot in journalism and 1 foot in scholarship. And then they decided that whichever way I went, I would be worthy of support. And I thanked them very much. I said I was very flattered, but I wanted them all to know that what they regarded as my problem, I regarded as my solution, which is to say that I intended to keep 1 foot in journalism and 1 foot in scholarship. And I was very fortunate. There used to exist a magazine called The New Republic. And I was very fortunate in being asked by Marty Peretz one day at coffee in Harvard Square if I wanted to come to the New Republic. I'd been debating whether I wanted an academic. I remember the exact moment I decided I didn't want an academic career. It happened in Harvard Yard, and I was walking with a graduate student friend of mine, and he asked me if I'd finished my seminar paper for the qualifying stuff for Jewish history, and I said I had. And I asked him if he had, and he said, well, no, he's going to take next year to do it. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to live that long. I mean, I needed something just a little faster. And went to Washington and was for 33 years the freest, happiest man alive. I mean, I've always, when people ask me what I am, I always, my professional description, as far as I'm concerned, is intellectual. It's not journalist. I've never, ever used the telephone as an instrument of research or knowledge. I don't believe in it. So I was for 33 years a very lucky man. Then everything went to hell. And now I'm beginning my second job.
So the way you framed this is just as I was thinking of it when I was rereading many of your pieces over the last several days. And that is, we'll come back to the whole New Republic issues, which I'm sure everyone wants to hear about. But it seemed to me
Speak of pornography, right? Yes.
The real frame to talk about your experiences and your position in the world is to ask about intellectual life in the 21st century. Because other things derive from that.
Absolutely.
And so you talked about having 2 feet. I think they're both squarely on that space of what is an intellectual and what should an intellectual be. And so let's talk about that for a little bit, because whether you have long-form journalism or digital journalism, or whether the New Republic survives, or whatever those questions are, they're really derivative from what should an intellectual life be and what's its condition in our time. So would you say a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, there's a large literature on what an intellectual is. The once famous critic Harold Rosenberg once said that an intellectual is anybody who carries a briefcase to work, which I guess has to be updated to anybody who has a laptop. I think it's more than that, obviously. I don't think the distinction between, in the 80s when this term public intellectual came into vogue, I never quite understood its purpose, because I don't know how you can be a public intellectual if you're not a private intellectual. You either are the thing or not. And it makes no sense to me, whereas it's true that we live in a variety of realms, and the realms are not all like each other, and some of the realms don't need to be brought into the public square for purposes of debate, though sometimes your thoughts do, but just for purposes of possible enlightenment, and basically you want to be useful to other people seeking answers to the same questions, but not everything is a political question. But I had always, I think of as an intellectual as somebody who thinks in the most general sense now philosophically about life. That is to say, who applies ideas to problems, inward problems, outward problems, for who is skeptical of first responses and of emotions. We all have feelings. I don't trust subjectivity. I think that we're not ever going to suffer from a dearth of subjectivity in our consideration of things. So it's all for me about not trusting emotions, not trusting numbers, but actually applying concepts and ideas. And again, I'm speaking very generally here, because the concepts and ideas can be drawn from a whole variety of sources, and then you get into the interesting discussion of why those sources or why those concepts, and then the ignition begins. But for me, it's about thinking philosophically about the way we live, It's really that. Now there are obviously people who do more specialized things, specialized scholars and so on, are also intellectuals in some way. But I kind of insist upon a grander notion of intellectual life. And one of the things that most concerns me now about American intellectual life is the extent to which it's lost its grandeur, and it's collapsed into specializations, quantifications, and emotions in various genres and on various platforms and so on.
And do you see that as related to the structures and institutions that support it? What has exerted this pressure on intellectual life? What's brought about this change?
Some of the explanation is that you can't really earn a living as an intellectual anymore. Mm-hmm. There was a time, hard as it is to imagine, and in that sense, I was born too late, when you could get tenure for 10 pieces in Partisan Review, which is how Irving Howe became a professor and Alfred Kazin became a professor, and many of their colleagues, which I thought was a terrific idea, but that's long gone. So some of it is about what it takes to earn a living. And I think some of it also these days is the ethos of technology. I think that there is, in America right now, the smartest question you can ask about anything is not whether it's true or false or good or bad, but how does it work? That's what everybody wants to know about everything. How does it work? As if knowing how something works is the deepest knowledge you can have of it. And if you want to seem like you're really smart, when you're at the dinner table and someone's explaining how something works, what you're supposed to say is, no, this is how it really works. And the person who knows how it really works is the genius at the table. And I think that whole approach, which in philosophy, speaking vulgarly, is called pragmatism, but more generally, as I say, is a kind of ethos. Mm-hmm. Americans always were a very practical people with a certain natural bias to certain kinds of philosophical speculation, corrected somewhat by the fact that we were also a very spiritual people, so it gets complicated. But the tyranny of the devices now, and in the beginning, 15 years ago, when people began to see that we're experiencing a tsunami, of the technology, the first subjects that concerned people were things, the lawyers got a hold of it first. So it was about privacy and copyright, both of which are enormously important subjects. But the lawyers got a hold of it really early, and they're really on it, and so on. But in the last 10 years, people have begun to realize that the impact is much, much deeper. And that what we really have to think about is the impact of this technology on cognition and on consciousness, and on culture. This is very, very deep stuff. It's very, very deep stuff. And as we all know from the history of technology, no technology is ever used when it's properly understood. we're always catching up with technological breakthroughs. Something is invented, the excitement is real, it has a basis in reality, the stuff gets used, and then we're wondering what on earth are we doing with this and what is it doing to us?
And so it's not how does it work, but what does it mean?
What does it mean?
That becomes the
Exactly. But
critical
what does it
question.
mean? Exactly. What does it mean? Those are the questions. I think people are now getting around to these questions. Some philosophers are, psychologists are, people are, but this is a roundabout answer to your question that there are many reasons why there's been this shrinkage, and these are just some of them. These are just some of them.
So you've said that we are inebriated by technology. If we weren't inebriated, what would we be doing instead? What would be the alternative?
We'd be living more slowly to begin with. I mean, the single most important fact about the technology is its speed, as far as I can tell. They finally, in the beginning, it was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I frequently remarked to myself from my perch at the New Republic that, they finally invented a medium of communication with no limitations of physical space, and everything on it had to be 400 words. And the reason was the speed. The speed. And the acceleration of everything is troublesome to me. I think we're accelerating ourselves beyond what our hearts and our minds can actually absorb. And we're all living checklist lives. We're all just getting everything done, or not, but we're all just getting everything done. And everything is, so the first thing we'd be doing is living more slowly. There are certain bastions against this acceleration. Reading, real reading. Sex, nothing you can do, you can't fast forward it. Music. You can walk out of a Bruckner symphony, but you cannot speed it up. You are at the mercy of whatever the tempo of a piece of music is, which is why it's one of the most honest-making and one of the great spiritual correctives of what we're living in. You can't do anything about it. You can walk out. Definitely can walk out, et cetera, et cetera. So the first reason is the speed. And that has to do, and if you speed things up, what you're really doing is diminishing or impoverishing or in some way even abolishing experience. Because experience takes place in time. There is, there's a 10th century Jewish philosopher who wrote a very influential book of philosophy, a rationalist work in Iraq, and in what is now Iraq. And in the foreword to his book, he asks a perfectly sensible question. He said, if God wanted us to know the answers, why didn't he just tell us? It's a perfectly good question. And the answer that Saadia gives is that because if he had told us, we wouldn't in strict sense know it. And what he's saying there is what would be absent is the dimension of time.
And
struggle, which is time, or method, or call it whatever you want. But that there is the experience of acquiring knowledge is what makes something, is part of the certainty that we have it in some way. And the technology, and this is something that concerns me enormously, and again, it's getting more sophisticated finally and so on. I'm not in any way a Luddite. And I have a 12-year-old son who's interested in nothing but coding. They know where to put the knife in. They always, they know just where to put it. What was I going to say? Yes. So it's really about the way there. And the technology reduces all knowledge to the status of information. And so we're living in a religion of information, so that if you can Google my zip code, and you can also type in, does God exist? And you'll get stuff. And they both will be experienced the same way, when they shouldn't be experienced the same way, et cetera, et cetera. So the speed it really worries me, I have to say. It really worries me.
So we each represent institutions that have been profoundly affected by these changes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about...
yours still exists. Yeah.
So let's talk about that.
Sure.
Talk about the New Republic, but also where is journalism going? Where's print journalism going? What does the New Republic's crisis represent in a larger sense? And how does it embody these issues?
I was happy to see that it was that the collapse of my magazine was a moment in our culture. You know, the solidarity that I and my colleagues experienced when we walked out was breathtaking, I have to say. I mean, the event was heartbreaking, but the consolation was this sense that people actually understood what the principles were. You know, and that night, I mean, even the internet, the Twitter sphere, suddenly, well, even my enemies had good things to say about me. I mean, I said to my wife, for 33 years, I've been attacking people. What does a man have to do to make an enemy? I mean, it was just
So you were surprised
oh
by
my
this.
God, yes. Oh my God, the magnitude of it, yes. But I think that a lot of people felt enough. I mean, you know, the quantification of everything, is distorting things. There are things that cannot be quantified. And that, I mean, as you know, you can certainly translate anything into a number. The question is, what do you capture and what do you lose when you translate it into a number? One of the first things I intend to do when I kind of get up to speed at Brookings, I'm just beginning to nest, is to have a longer project on the question of quantification and culture. Because, you know, where do numbers belong, where don't they belong? What is properly quantified, what is, you know, I'm told by friends, museums in considering whether to have certain shows, and I mean important retrospectives of great painters, old master painters, now have a metric, because everything has a metric, of how many dollars spent for every visitor who walks through the door. I mean, that's no way to decide whether to assemble a great Watteau show. So there is, I think people really felt, what happened at the New Republic was that the nature of our discourse was being changed, We were going to be taken from the kind of discourse that we had done for 100 years, which in my view, there is still, and I'll get to this in a moment, there is still a burning need for, and a huge audience for, I might add. And everything was going to become what one of our brilliant new leaders called snackable. And I mean, I yield to no one in my love of snacks, but I don't mistake my books for them. But my own view is that, you know, and this is why I'm seriously thinking of starting a journal next year, is in absolute numbers, there exists a vast audience for serious intellectual discourse in this country, in absolute numbers. Certainly, the numbers are large enough to support a journal. And moreover, the problems that this country is facing have never been more confusing and more complicated. I mean, one of the frightening things about our society right now is so many of the real crises in American life are too arcane for most Americans to understand. Civil rights was easy by comparison, but the financial crisis, even the banks didn't understand what they were doing, and healthcare and climate change. And we have esoteric emergencies. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem in a democracy. And experts are not the answer because there are dueling experts. And if there were meta-experts, there'd be dueling meta-experts. So it would be an infinite regress to think tanks. So it's the problems have not gotten any easier. The need for extended, serious, conceptual and scholarly analysis has never been greater. And the terrible thing is that at precisely this moment, the economic and, if you will, technical cultural pressures on the institutions of deliberative thinking have also never been greater, And I worry about that a lot.
Your position at Brookings has a really interesting title, which is, this is a policy think tank, and you are a director or something equivalent to that of culture and humanities policy.
Yeah.
So you just described a social crisis, a cultural crisis. Are there policies that you think can be advocated to support the very important kinds of endeavors that you're describing?
I think that at a very concrete level in various realms, there would be policies, but I think before we get to policies, one of the things that I've been writing about in recent years and that I want to continue writing about at Brookings is that we as a society begin to get our priorities right about what we really care about. I think that we are letting too much culture, and we can talk about what culture means, slip through our fingers. Really just, it's shocking. And there are problems. I mean, if you talk to people who run symphony orchestras, they don't know what to do. The average age you go to a concert, and I mean, it's frightening, and et cetera, et cetera. Museums are having problems. Publishers are having problems. And everybody talks about this disruption as disruption. Everybody's a bargain basement Schumpeter, right? Everybody talks about creative destruction. The problem is that there's a lot of destruction and not much creative destruction. And so all these disruptions may seem economically very exciting, but what they're doing is if you look at the map, if you just go across the map of our culture, they're damaging institutions that I don't think we really want to do without. But if we don't actually decide that we don't want to do without them, the steady drip, the economicism of everything. I mean, most media talk. You said I was on Charlie Rose. We talked about this the other night. Most media talk is really culture talk, is business talk disguised as culture talk. It's all about business. And the internet, which was supposed to be the Wild West or some, libertarian fantasy, is the greatest opportunity for large corporations. I mean, the monopolistic habits of mind that the internet has inspired are extraordinary. I mean, just extraordinary. And I think that, and I don't mean to be a total downer about this. Obviously, there are benefits and so on and so forth, but we all know what they are. I mean, we don't need another person to cheerlead about this stuff. There are plenty of cheerleaders about this stuff. I just think that, do we want museums to close? Do we want symphony orchestras to close? Do we want the New Republic to be trashed? I mean, it didn't close, but I mean, it may as well have, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I said the other night that the New Republic is to the old New Republic as Paris, Texas is to Paris, France. With no disrespect intended to Paris, Texas. So I think that we really have to decide. And some of this, in an academic setting, as far as I'm concerned, comes down to a fight for the humanities.
Yeah. Okay.
To a fight for the humanities. I mean, what's happening to the humanities now is scandalous. It amuses me to hear, I mean, there are distinguished scientists here, actually, at Harvard, friends of mine, who seem to think that the sciences are besieged. I'm not sure I understand that unless they want to concentrate on the Christian right. But I'm not sure the Christian right is impeding any scientific research over at the Science Center at Harvard. But the humanities are really in trouble, not just financially, but young people are not electing to study them or to pursue them as careers. They're justified entirely in economic terms. The only way you can justify the humanities these days legitimately and get a seat at the table is in some utilitarian way. Because it's good, theaters are good for the economy of a city, or English majors get really good jobs in Silicon Valley, but that's not what the humanities are about. And so I think that on the question of I've become a kind of humanities fundamentalist. I mean, meaning that there is some sense of intrinsicness that the humanities teaches. I mean, some defiantly non or anti-utilitarian frame of mind or frame of heart or frame of soul that I don't think a person can live a significant life without. And this concept of the humanities, and it's as far as I can see, it's under siege everywhere. It's under siege everywhere.
But you've just framed this in the context of the market issue. I think the earlier issue you spoke about plays into this too, which is the cognition, the transformation of cognition. I had a lunch for humanities faculty a week or so ago, and we were talking about the foundations of some of the challenges they're facing. And one of the things they commented on was people don't read.
Yeah.
And so much of the humanities requires deep and extensive reading. And if everything is snackable and your mind is adjusted for short snackable consumption, that also undermines the appeal and structure of the humanities.
Look, the truth is, I bet people read more now than they ever did.
But in bits.
But in little bits. I bet people read many millions of more words now than they ever did before. On an average day, I bet more people read more than they ever dreamed they would read. But there is the question of the fate of human attention. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about this beautiful technology is that it is the greatest single assault on human attention ever devised. And it's complicated because on the one hand, there's nothing, it pushes back the horizons. And, remember Microsoft's first slogan a million years ago? It was, where do you want to go today? Remember, that's what it was. And I used to hear that, and I used to think, well, that can be either construed to be an invitation to complexity, or it can be construed to be an invitation to promiscuity. And promiscuity is kind of a degraded version of complexity. And I think so people read all the time. And the joke about all these vast corporations is that they would expire without what they call content. And content is language. And content is produced by these people who used to be called writers. And without writers, most of these places would disappear. So there is some sinister inversion of things going on. How one fights for sustained human attention, as I said, that's complicated. I mean, there are some examples I gave earlier. I mean, I worry about this in my own tradition. I worry about the impact of the internet on Jewish identity in some ways, because the Jewish tradition, Jewish identity of all traditions, and many are, not the only one, is based on sustained attention. I mean, we are a verbal tradition. We are a tradition of study. We are not a tradition of toggling. And the idea is that you've got to learn to be in one place. Kierkegaard once wrote a book called Purity of Heart is to will one thing at a time. That's about that is such anathema now. Right now, purity of heart, these days, purity of heart is to will one thing every other minute. Right? So there is some way in which we have become, in our consciousness, promiscuous. Lots of stuff, lots of stimulation, endless stimulation. And of course, endless stimulation is basically a form of infantilization. I mean, but endless stimulation, endless excitement, endless hysteria, everything, breaking news, everything's breaking all the time. All the time, nothing isn't breaking.
When it's not being disrupted.
Yeah, right, when it's, right, exactly. When it's not being disrupted, it's breaking, exactly. No, exactly. And so there is some kind of insane way in which we've lost any ability to be calm. To be calm. And I don't mean calm like the Buddha. I mean just ordinary, regular, quotidian calm.
So as you're saying this, I'm thinking, I wonder if part of the responsibility of a university is to nurture sustained attention.
Absolutely.
And I think about the work of one of our colleagues in the History of Art department, Jennifer Roberts, who's written a wonderful essay on slowing down, on patience, which I will share with you. But in her one of her History of Art classes, she assigned students to go and look at a work of art for 3 hours.
Perfect.
This is unimaginable
Perfect.
to
That's
these
correct.
students, just unimaginable.
They must go out of their mind.
Until they do it.
Yeah.
And then they realize, hour 2, what they've seen that they didn't see in hour 1.
That's right.
And so I think of that as a pedagogical obligation, perhaps.
The truth is that once you've experienced something like that, it changes everything, meaning that you then have a standard for what it is to know something or to experience something. And it may be difficult at first, but anyone who, I think, anyone who's actually spent the time with a piece of music but has really, really stayed with it, it's, and it's, sometimes, we all know people like this who travel around the world. Well, you do all the time. I mean, you're like this. But I mean, we travel. No, I know. But we travel. Everybody travels everywhere. Everybody's at the Great Wall of China all the time. And a friend of mine came back to me.
You meet the nicest people there.
I'm sure. Yeah. Any Chinese? They must all be Americans. I mean, it's just a. But I remember thinking one day when someone came back and reported about a trip, I thought, travel sometimes narrows the mind. I mean, in the sense that sometimes you have to actually, the point is not wide, but deep is how you have to go. Everybody knows how to go wide and is rewarded for going wide. But deep is an entirely different matter. I mean, in art you see this. I mean, there are, you take a painter like Chardin, whose range spiritually was like from here to here. But the depth of it is beyond belief. Beyond belief. Or, I don't know, Miles Davis, right? Miles Davis played, Miles's moods ran from A to D. But they were really profound when he played. And there's some way in which people have to learn to stay in one place and go deep. And I think you're right. It's a pressing pedagogical obligation, I think, to make people do this. Even if, and they have to bind themselves to the math. It's torture for people now.
And the multitasking of students, even in a class, is a challenging issue for faculty. I know that's been something here at the law school that many faculty have talked to me about. Do you have laptops open or shut during a class?
Yeah.
How many inputs can a person take?
Well, this is it. How many inputs can, right. And also, what happens when some of the most precious texts or images or sounds in any civilization become inputs, right? Which is already a term, which is already a concession to the tyranny of information.
And also to the dehumanization of the subject.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, I think the only revolutionary act left to perform anywhere is to slow anything down, is what I think. Anything. I think it's the greatest mitzvah in the world. But in this culture, it sometimes requires courage.
Let's let others
You're sure? I didn't mean to go on.
No. I've had a great opportunity to ask questions. Let's let others do it. Howard.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh,
Howard, I think we'd like you to go to the microphone because some people are watching this on streaming and they won't be able to hear you.
hi, Howard.
Hi, thanks for stimulating us. You've been using the term, Leon, we all the time.
Yeah.
In our culture. So it'd be important to see to what extent are you talking about, the United States today or the rest of the world? To what extent is this a statement about the culture we know the best or a universal one? And in that context, are there places or institutions which you really think as an entity are very, very different? There are always going to be people everywhere and small groups everywhere who can slow down and go deep. But I guess I'm asking, do you think of any oases in our time, not looking back historically?
I think that, again, every oasis can be abused. So that, I would say that anyone who walked properly into the Museum of Fine Arts here and actually decided to not get Impressionism under his belt before lunch, but to actually go look at a picture, right? But I think religious institutions can sometimes serve that purpose. I think that religious institutions are where a certain kind of patience and humility and sense of larger difficulty, I think it's where they sought sanctuary. Now, the problem with, I don't mean to idealize this, because when you walk into most religious institutions, including my own, that's not the first impression you get. But still, there is some sense in which, churches and synagogues and mosques can be sanctuaries for a certain pace of thought and a certain ambition to depth and so on. Or let's put it this, at least the questions that are posed there are very large. And sometimes I think that one is, that we're really talking, when we speak about intellectual or spiritual life, we're talking about the scale at which we choose to operate. I remember a critic once said about Saul Bellow that the reason he was better than his peers, than his contemporaries, was because while they were competing with John O'Hara, he was competing with D.H. Lawrence. And in other words, there's some sense, to use a baseball, he chose to play in a much higher, harder league. And I think the scale of things has something to do with it. Otherwise, I think I have to say there's no institution of meaning that cannot be experienced shallowly. None. I mean, there's no protection against it. So some of it has to do with teachers, and some of it has to do with intellectual friendships of a certain kind of old-fashioned kind. And some of it has to do with organized study. And by study, I mean textual study, though a picture or a piece of music can be a text too. I don't just mean literary study. But I think it has to be created. It has to be created. Yeah, I mean, I think that you asked, am I speaking for the entirety of the human race? Of course not. And it's in America, certainly, we've always had a certain allergy to certain types of philosophical ambition. Though, as I said earlier, it's compensated for by the fact that we are spiritually the most innovative, or I mean, which may mean we're the craziest society on earth. But still, I have a, I think that that kind of craziness just errs in the right direction. I mean, I've always been very tolerant of that stuff. And even if you look at someone like William James, William James is a saint because he was the father of pragmatism. William James was the most intensely spiritual figure. William James wound up with parapsychological experiments. His whole notion of pragmatism was to get the soul alive, was to kind of stimulate it in some way that would strike some people as extremely new agey, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if I'm answering your question in any way. I know. So yes and no. I mean, there's nothing that can't be corrupted. But what just to say, there's a lot that's valuable. I mean, when you say that something can be corrupted, you're actually saying that you hope it isn't because it's valuable. So it's all about the attitudes we have towards classrooms, museums, concert halls, study rooms, religious spaces. It's and small things. I got an email the other day from a friend, and the email was the most wonderful email. It was at least 1,500 words long. And she was writing to me about various emotional things she'd experienced and so on. And I suddenly was reading, when I was reading it, I thought to myself, this is not an email. This is what used to be called a letter. It's a letter. And I felt really happy that somebody wrote me a letter, which hasn't happened in 15 years. So it's all about policing ourselves. As I said, I think that the important thing is to actually be a little worried and have some sense of what is lost. The problem is that the generations, I'm 62 years old. I'm a transitional figure. I mean, I was raised on books in a very rigorous classical textual fetishistic way, and then I had to adopt to the new technologies and so on. But my son, who is 12, is starting out with this stuff. And, I'm not sure, I'm not sure he's even going to have a sense of what was lost, except I'm going to do my damnedest to give him one, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Other questions? Please just go to the microphones. I was thinking while we're waiting for someone to come to the microphone that when you describe the religious environments as places that are possibly exempt from the negativities you've described, they're ones that, to a certain extent, are outside the market. They have a value that is
That's correct.
higher than the market.
That's right.
And I think that may,
non-quantifiable, non-utilitarian, non-market. That's right.
may give a different valence.
That's right. One of the other things I wanted to say, too, and then I'll get to the question, is maybe, in my experience, one of the things that's happening is that people have been, instead of people are giving up, they're despairing, serious people. And so what they're trying to do is take the things I'm talking about and turn them into what they call fun. And I think that maybe if you can get someone to a genuine experience of depth, if you can give someone a sense of profundity about anything, that may be more lasting than fun. There is some way in which there's this kind of ingratiating, 11th hour effort to save the stuff by making it jolly. And so my own view is that actually, human nature, Virginia Woolf said that human nature changed in February 1910, which was a very idiotic thing to say. Human nature also didn't change in Silicon Valley in 1990. We're still producing human beings. And those human beings still have selves or souls, or call them whatever you want, but there's some difference there that we're talking about. And I tend to think that maybe fun is not what that maybe a more attractive, straight-ahead approach towards something deep would actually be more exciting, I think.
Please.
When you were talking about intellectuals, you differentiated between being an intellectual and then, in some sense, negatively, process of specialization. You've just distinguished between depth and breadth, emphasizing the value of depth. I wonder if you could explicate the difference for us between specialization and depth.
Well, let me say it this way. I regard, look, specialization is the essence of scholarship. There are some things about which I'm a specialist too. And you're not a scholar unless you are a specialist. So I'm not saying that everyone should be generalists, because what that means is we have a nation of perfect dinner party guests. And that's not the ideal. I regard the downside of specialization as specific knowledge that isn't possessed with an awareness of any larger ideas or principles that may be provoked by it. In other words, that there's something contained about the specialization. I mean, you know, there's Flaubert or Warburg or whoever said that God is in the details. I mean, my point is that if you have the details, you have to have God, too. And that specialization for me is, you know, there are, I mean, for example, I've never read, you know, which I'm very proud of this. I couldn't read it. I never read the federal budget, right? Which is all numbers. But we all know that the federal budget is a numerical shorthand for a picture of society. If you want to know what a government's picture of a society is, look at the federal budget. Similarly, I'm sure at a university, if you want to know what the university's values are, look at the budget, and you get a sense of what's more important and less important. But so there are ways, even reading numbers, even specializing in that stuff. I mean, you know, economic specializations broach deep philosophical questions about equality and justice and so on. So all that matters for me is that the specialists be alive to these other dimensions, and that it not just be, you know, Moneyball, that it not just be, I mean, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of gratification for specialists in their specialization. And as I say, I read scholarship for pleasure in the fields that I care about. I mean, I just, you know, 2 in the morning, I kick back with a new paper about a 16th century Czech Jewish intellectual. But there has to be something spiritually nourishing about the scholarship. That's what matters to me. So that you come away from the scholarship with some sense of the stakes. That's what I mean. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for the input first. So I'm coming from a background sort of with wearing different hats, though I'm wearing one.
You're wearing one,
yeah. But so first I come from a traditional background where there's a native skepticism of technology on the one hand. So no TV, things like that. Also, I direct the Mindfulness Society here.
The which
is
society?
The Mindfulness Society.
I see.
So that's sort of active cultivation of attention. Mm-hmm. Then I'm also very much immersed in actual technology and clicking. And seeing in the law school, for example, how there's a kind of, perhaps this is leading to a superficial way of thinking about things and a lack of profundity, like you're speaking. And I'm wondering what the way is forward. Is it this kind of counter-technology movement? Is it cultivating attention? Is it school-based initiatives?
Look, the technology is here. The technology comes with many blessings. There's no question about it. And there's no point in, there's no point in, fantastic, nostalgic, that's not interesting. I think basically that well, in the setting of universities, I regard the people most primarily responsible for this, they are the teachers. The professors, the teachers. I think they're the primary aid, they're the people who disseminate the priorities or the emphases or so on. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter to me if one reads a text, modern, medieval, whatever, on a piece of paper or on a Kindle. It's the same text. It's the same text. What does matter to me is that the dizziness about the technology and the busyness that the technology facilitates not distract from the old-fashioned experience of the text. So for example, what I mean is I had this discussion recently, I've been involved, the National Library in Jerusalem is now redoing itself in some really spectacular way. There's going to be a new building, they're doing amazing digital things, and I've been involved with this. And so we had this interesting debate with the curators and the librarians, and they were going on and on, they were telling me about how much they're putting online. Texts, manuscripts, letters, maps, fragments, everything. So I said to them, let's pretend for a moment, let's get over this excitement, and let's pretend that the day has come, and the day will come, in 10 years or 20 years, whatever, when everything is up. When everything is online, it's all been done. Every last piece of paper in every library in the world can be accessed. So I think, so on the one hand, A, that's great. Universal accessibility, or the democratization of knowledge, call it what you want, that's terrific. It's like what happened when they broke the monopoly of those awful people who wouldn't let anyone see the Dead Sea Scrolls, remember? I mean, that's over. That's over. That's great. But let's say, okay, everything is up. Now what? We still need people who know how to read these things and who understand that all the digitalization in the world and all the search in the world, and search is going to get so sophisticated that, et cetera, all the search in the world will not relieve us of the obligation to interpret. And interpretation is the fundamental humanistic activity. And interpretation has methods and schools and so on. So what concerns me is that, as I say, we'll get it all done. It's all very exciting. Everyone should have goose flesh. And if you're on vacation in Bora Bora, you can access a manuscript of Nachmanides' letter on dying, right? I mean, everybody's got everything everywhere on their phone. It's done. Now what? Now what? And as I say, I'm not sure that the devices teach anything at all or anything useful about the interpretation that inevitably has to follow the representation of these materials. So I see the universal access and the so-called democratization of knowledge actually as making critical thinking and interpretive tools more necessary, not less necessary. And the old methods seem to me to have a greater urgency in a situation in which everyone is living in this welter. Everyone is living in this welter. It's going to be unmanageable. It's already unmanageable. I mean, the amount of, well, I mean, never mind, I mean, data, put the big data thing aside, the amount of data that's being generated is genuinely unimaginable, even as we speak, But not numbers, texts, words. It's unmanageable, which means that more than ever, we are going to need people who can guide us through this and help us interpret this and not let us just drown in all this. So is this useful to you? I mean, I think that, that's how I would begin an answer to your question. And again, so it's not about being pro or against technology. And you know, I mean, certainly Orthodox Jews, I mean, for a variety of, they have, there is a commandment, there's a mitzvah, tradition in Judaism called Harbatzat Torah, right? You're supposed to disseminate the Torah as widely as you can. And for this purpose, the internet is a godsend, if you pardon the expression, right? I mean, it's but so what? But so what? I mean, everybody will have it and nobody will know how to understand it. If the humanistic muscles are allowed to atrophy or disappear,
My grandmother was from Hyderabad, Deccan in India, and she gave me a conception of Sufism and how I experienced it. So I have access to spirituality in a way that is ever present, and I have a way to do it because of this personal relationship. So I'm wondering if family perhaps is still a way to have these relationships and these bonds transfer, if you're lucky enough.
Well,
but if
yeah,
I may,
I'm sorry.
one more.
Sure, I'm sorry.
So I happen to be from Pakistan, and what I'm really troubled by, because I see that you're troubled by American culture, what I'm really troubled by is how much it transfers. So the tyranny of the breaking news, if you open, Pakistan, India, you name it, the breaking news phenomenon, the television pundits, the cacophony, is rampant. And why do they do it? Because they see America as a very successful nation. And everyone's just trying to emulate this country. Where do we put the brakes? How do we have these alternate conversations and slow time down?
I wish in Pakistan they tried to emulate certain other aspects of America. Look, the family question is an interesting one. As those of you will know who grew up in a family is sometimes the last bulwark against spiritual life. That's not usually, and spiritual life or intellectual life is a very individuating kind of thing. That is to say, one discovers it in oneself and then one finds other people. It's not that one doesn't have communities, but you have to find them. I mean, the Arabs have a proverb that the donkeys smell each other across 7 valleys, right? I mean, you find the people of like souls or like minds, and you do your work with them. I would not, I think spiritual life is not for children, it's for grown-ups. And I think that, though I do think, many years ago at the Society of Fellows here, there was a remarkable man, a judge named Charlie Wieseltier, who came to dinner one night. And we were drinking brandy, and late one night he said to me, we were talking about religion, and he said to me that the only people who have freedom of choice in matters of religion as adults are people who were indoctrinated in religion as children. That remark always stuck with me, because you can't reject something that you don't know. In other words, and so on the one hand, my own view is that you have to raise children in traditions, let's say, either religious traditions or secular humanistic traditions, but traditions. I mean, but then they grow up and they have their freedom of mind, for which we should be grateful. We can't control their conviction. The only thing we can have some control of is their competence. And spiritual life, intellectual life, let's just call it human identity of a thoughtful kind, actually requires a certain competence. It requires tools of certain kind, either languages or methods of interpretation, but competence. So, I don't think that sometimes families need to be corrected by I remember, who was it? Yes, Woodrow Wilson, whom I never quote, once said that when he was president of Princeton, he said that the purpose of a college education is to make a man as much unlike his father as possible. And I always like that. Which is what the people who homeschool their kids understand. Mm-hmm.
Not too many years ago, I think it might have been in the New Republic, I'm not sure, a prominent Harvard professor of English was described as one of the high priests of intellectual gibberish. Mm-hmm. And this comes out of the post-structuralist trend in the humanities, where you have a lot of people claiming that they're doing deep specialization, mm-hmm. and I would say quite often you could find things wrong with it if you could take the time to cut through the thicket. And then it swung toward history. A few years ago, I went to a Shakespeare conference where there was a large auditorium with a very few people in it, and most of them were old, and a few students who I think had been told to be there by the professor. And I'm listening to this talk about traveling players in Elizabethan England, about, what did the actors eat? What do the actors' horses eat? Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at the students.
You weren't spiritually nourished by that.
Yeah, they were just waiting to escape.
Yeah.
And then just a couple of weeks ago, I went to a lecture here by Franco Moretti.
Oh, yeah.
And he's
I know.
figuring out how to make algorithms read thousands of novels and cough up colored charts.
Yeah, I know. It's very magical.
Do you have a question, sir?
Well, what I'm saying is that when you talk about the humanities versus the internet and so on, the humanities have problems. And to say that, the humanities, that's where we all are deep and so on.
I think you raise an important point, and I think that you're right. We didn't discuss this, and it's a very important chapter of this discussion, which is what humanists or certain humanists have done with the humanities. There's no question that it's like I used to think when I read about the art market and things, I always wonder, what did art ever do to deserve art people, right? And sometimes I think, what did the humanities ever do to deserve humanists? And there's no question, and it's not just, I'll tell you, you complain about theory, I would kill for Derrida right now, because Derrida was at least philosophically primary stuff. I mean, if you were to argue against Derrida, you were doing first principle kind of stuff. I mean, it was a very stimulating fight. It really was. You're right. I think that humanists have not always served the humanities well, but I think that's true in any tradition. I think that I don't know what you do about that. Part of it is that the humanists that I know seem to want to have too much fun, as I was saying. I think that. And some of it is that, et cetera. I just think that the critique of the humanities as it's concretely practiced and taught, it's a big conversation, and there's a place for it. But it shouldn't be used as a reason not only should it not be used as a reason to delegitimate or make the humanities less important, it's in the name of the humanities that one quarrels with certain humanists. And what Moretti is doing is it's humanistic big data. Or what do they call it now? It's digital humanities of a certain kind, right? We can now search for the word pipe in every novel that was ever published. And if you do it, you will discover, and I hope they don't give you too big a grant for this discovery, that pipes tend to be referred to more in cultures where they're actually used. You discover amazing things this way, amazing things. So yeah, there are, as I said, and the technology, if you look at the digital humanities, and there are a couple of books that have recently come out that are kind of manifestos of the digital humanities, they're very troubling. They're very troubling because they are it's an attempt to kind of find some equivalent to quantification within the humanities. It isn't exactly quantification because it's not about numbers exactly, though some of it is. But there's something that, and again, when one looks at search, which is the most, for everybody, the most exciting feature and so on and so on, the really interesting question is about searches, do you ever find anything you're not searching for, right? There's the question of serendipity, osmosis. I remember, I don't know, are the Stacks and Widener still open to graduate students? In which case, are they really?
Yeah.
Then it's still the biggest candy store in the world. But I remember when I would go into Widener, it was always, the book that I needed was the book next to the book that I went to look for, always, always. And so one has to think critically about search and what advances in knowledge and understanding are gained by the results of search. And search is getting very sophisticated, but et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
We're just about out of time. We have one
Yeah, good.
questioner. I don't want to leave one person out. So could you be very efficient in posing your question?
Of course. Thank you for that. And thank you for your words. My dad's very much into nostalgia, and it seems as if there's like this loss of past that you're talking about. And I'm wondering to what extent, or I should say, in what ways has losing the past impacted us?
Has losing
The past impacted us.
Oh, well, that's obviously, as you know, a huge question. I think that, firstly, since we're talking about the technology, one of the biggest hoaxes that was ever perpetrated on the culture, whoever named what the computer holds, whoever named it memory, was perpetrating a great hoax, because in fact there is no remembering where there is no forgetting. There is no memory on the computer. It's an inventory, it's an attic. It's got everything. That's not memory. Memory is selective, it's editorial, it's guided by emphases or ideas or experiences or emotions or whatever. So in the first place, we have to recover our sense of that. In the second place, I think, as you know, memory has become, and you certainly know this from your work, in the last 20 or 30 years, memory has become an almost cultic category for certain people. Memory has become almost our mysticism in some way, as it was for Proust in some way. It was actually his mysticism. And one of the things we have to remember is that memory is fallible and needs to be corrected, and it needs to be corrected by history, by scholarship. So there's that. Thirdly, what we call the past is an interpretation of the past. So, I mean, again, nobody comes from all of the past. And we go through life adding pasts to our identity that we didn't inherit. We actually acquire pasts, which is a way of deepening our identity. And we have reasons for acquiring certain pasts. Acquiring a past is basically declaring oneself a member of a community of a certain kind. Mm-hmm. And I'm not just talking about conversion experiences, even something less intense than that. So I think that it's important to have a sense, I don't want to say it's important to have a sense of what came before, obviously, but the acceleration of everything is going to make our sense of temporality thinner and thinner and thinner. Really thinner and thinner and thinner. Time, and this is about the biggest cliche that can be uttered. We're inconceivable without time. We're inconceivable without time. Whatever you think about that, and there are people who rebel against that philosophically and spiritually and so on. And I think that anything that narrows our sense of time, diminishes our experience of time, abolishes our sense of time, which is sometimes the case. I mean, you know, sometimes when you go on these technologies and when one lives the life that we live, sometimes things are not just fast, they're instantaneous. I mean, it's, you know, that Stephen Wright, who was a comedian many years ago, once had a joke. He said that, what did he say? I put instant coffee in the microwave and almost went backwards in time, he said. You know, I mean, things get so crazy, so we may wind up living in some kind of eternal present of passing stimulations. And that actually, if you think about it, is an animal form of existence. That's an animal form of existence. That's not really a human form of existence. We can't constantly be stimulated, and there must be things behind us and not just around us, to use a spatial metaphor. So that would be, but it's a long answer.
Thank you.
Leon, I'm very reassured to think that you are at the Brookings, at the Atlantic, and this possible new journal you've referred to,
Well,
going to help us answer the question you asked, which is, now what?
Now what, right?
Now what? Thank you very much.
You're
Please
very
join me
sweet,
in
thank you. Thank you.
A little memento.
Oh, isn't that
Oh
sweet?
my goodness, thank you.
Thank you for holding our attention, giving us a new past, and reminding us to interpret, which we will be working on for some time. Thank you all for
Thank you,
Thank
Martha.
you. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Thank you.